Happy birthday. All right, we are going to continue our study now, and here's where we are in the life of King David. 2 Samuel has so much to do with King David, his life, his reign, his history, his family, the nation of Israel, and what's going on there. We have closed out chapter 13. We spent a good amount of time there. We combed through that especially well. And as you end the chapter 13, and about verse 38 or so, you have Absalom, who has now worked his vengeance on his brother Amnon. Amnon, his half-brother, attacked, violated his sister Tamar. And Absalom just took his time in a vengeful way, waited for the right opportunity, and after 2 full years, he took vengeance on his brother Amnon and he slew him. Now Absalom is on the run for his life. He knows there's going to be repercussions to that. And he has gone across the Jordan River. And he's at a place called Geshur. And he's over there with his grandfather. And so Talmai is his grandfather. And he's over there at Geshur hanging out for a couple of years, letting the dust settle. And David is comforted at the end of chapter 13 concerning his son Amnon, who is now dead. And he longs to go out to Absalom, but he just hasn't brought himself to reach out that way to make contact with him. And we're going to find some intervention from his commander of the army named Joab, who's going to give him a nudge that way. And so that's how we're entering chapter 14. This is intended as a summary of chapter 14, moving us as quickly as we can toward chapter 15, when Absalom is going to instigate a rebellion to seize the throne of his father, what we would call a coup. And so we're just laying a little bit of information in chapter 14 to get us to chapter 15 and discuss that in more detail. Joab can sense, the end of chapter 13, verse 39, Joab can sense David wants to reach out to Absalom, and he has a plan he's going to put in motion. The first 3 verses of our text, please. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, remember Zeruiah, who's Zeruiah? Oh, how quickly we forget. All right, let me ask it this way. Who is she? David's sister. That's David's sister. And so you're talking about now Joab is his nephew. And so Joab, the son of Zeruiah, that's David's sister, perceived that the king's heart was inclined toward Absalom. So Joab sent to Tekoa and brought a wise woman from there and said to her, "Please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments now, and do not anoint yourself with oil, but be like a woman who's been mourning for the dead many days. Then go to the king and speak to him in this manner." So Joab put the words in her mouth. Now, I've always encouraged this as we study the Bible together. When you run across a geographical location, it's always good to find a Bible map and try to locate that. So this woman's from Tekoa. Where's Tekoa? Anybody? It's not something we usually do, is it? We know the basics. We know the Sea of Galilee. We know Jerusalem, maybe Hebron. We know a few places like that, Sodom and Gomorrah. But some of these other places we just read and sort of pass over, and maybe we don't think about it. It's just kind of interesting to see where these people are at if the Bible map knows. Some places we don't know, they're guesses. And on your map sometimes there'll be a question mark. They're saying, here's where they think it is, whoever they are. And but Tekoa is one that we have a pretty good idea of. Anybody find it yet? 7 miles southwest of Jerusalem, thereabouts, Tekoa. So you go 7 to 10 miles south of Jerusalem and you find Tekoa. And this story that Joab is putting in her mouth to use with David, does it have any recollection in your mind? Does it sound like anything else we've heard recently? Not exactly. What happened when David sinned with Bathsheba and then killed Uriah? How did God reach him? Through Nathan. And Nathan telling a parable about a man with a little ewe lamb and a rich man who had plenty. And Nathan tells this parable. Now here's the difference. This one's cooked up by Joab. This is man's effort to be like the inspired Nathan. And so when Joab tells this woman to do this, you're going to notice right away it involves purposeful deception. And so man's effort to do this is not like the inspired parable that Nathan told. This one has built into it some ploys that are not honest. And so when man tries to imitate God, tries to copy God, but they do it through their own imagination, you always end up with a flavor of sin involved in it. And so Joab cooks this one up, and it automatically involves a lot of deception. And so he puts the words in her mouth. And it's going to have some similarities to Absalom's situation, but to be enough different that David won't recognize what's going on at first. He's going to be asked to pass a judgment in a court case, and in passing the judgment, he's going to be sort of indicting himself and his lack of relationship with Absalom. And that's the nudge that Joab's trying to give him to go get Absalom and bring him back. Verse 4. Any comments before we get to verse 4 and following? Verses 4 through 11. Now when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and prostrated herself and said, "Help me, O king." The king said to her, "What is your trouble?" And she answered, "Truly I am a widow." You know, in the New Testament, there's a text about being a widow indeed. And she said, "Truly, I am a widow, for my husband is dead. Your maidservant had, past tense, 2 sons. But the 2 of them struggled together in the field, and there was no one to separate them. So one struck the other and killed him. Now behold, the whole family has risen against your maidservant. And they say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed, and destroy the heir also.'" Now that would be a widow indeed. And her point is, there would be nobody to carry on my family name. The family name would die. It would be the end of it. There's only 2 boys. One killed the other. They struggled. No one separated them. And now the family says, "Oh, you got to bring out the one who killed the other. We need to put him to death for killing his brother." And she comes to the king with this plea. And she said, "Thus they will extinguish my coal which is left, so as to leave my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth." All right. David's going to give a judgment in the case, beginning in verse 8. Then the king said to the woman, "Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you." The woman of Tekoa said to the king, "O my lord, the king, the iniquity is on me and my father's house, but the king and his throne are guiltless." So the king said, "Whoever speaks to you, bring him to me, and he will not touch you anymore." Then she said, "Please let the king remember the Lord your God, so that the avenger of blood will not continue to destroy. Otherwise they will destroy my son." And he said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." So here's a summary of what we've got. And yes, there are a lot of details here that would be something to explore, but not today. We're going to pass through this rather quickly. So here's the gist of it, the summary of what we've read. One brother in this story kills the other. The family is calling for the execution of the surviving son as a matter of justice. This would be the avenger of blood, which is mentioned in the account. The family has the next of kin, the avenger of blood, who would come and slay the guilty party. And so the family's calling for that execution. That would extinguish the family name with no one to carry it on. And so this is the gist of where we're at so far. And after the ruling to spare her son, that's what David has ruled, I'll see to it that no one troubles you. Not one hair of his head will fall to the ground. And that's the ruling he gives. Then she's going to tell him, well, this was really just a story. This was like a parable. And it's really about you and Absalom. And so now she's getting down to that point, beginning in verse 12. Then the woman said, please let your maidservant speak a word to my lord the king. And he said, speak. The woman said, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in speaking this word, the king is as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring back his banished one. One son was killed by the other, and now the one that survives has run off to hide for his life, and you're not saving his life. You're not preserving his life. It's going to matter to the nation. It's going to matter to everything. And so that's the way she's applying it. For we will surely, verse 14, we will surely die and are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one will not be cast out from him. And I'd like you to mark down, at least in your mind, verse 14. If there is a ring of truth in anything in this account, verse 14 is the point that I would mark down. And here is a truth that is told in the midst of a deception. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one will not be cast out from him. That is true. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The world is lost. God was planning ways before the foundation of the world to rescue those lost in sin. He plans for ways for the banished one to return. Even when someone is disciplined in church discipline and withdrawn from because they will not repent of their sin, the plan is to restore them, if at all possible. The Lord always plans ways to restore. He doesn't want to extinguish. When you get to 2 Peter 3 and verse 9, the Lord's not slack concerning His promise, as some count slackness. He's long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. The Lord always plans ways to restore. Now, whether or not man agrees with that or helps with that, that's something else. But God always seeks to save. Will He finally banish, ultimately, eternally? The answer to that is yes. For those who will not repent, He will banish forever out of His presence. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. Those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, they'll be removed from His presence for all eternity. Destroyed from the very presence of God. That will occur. It's not that He won't punish eternally. It's not that He won't banish. But He seeks ways to restore. So, verse 14, there is something important to mark down there and to grasp the truth of that part of it. Verse 15, now the reason I've come to speak this word to my lord the king is that the people have made me afraid. That's interesting wording. I want you to think about that. The people have made me afraid. She's at the point where she's spilling the beans and she's telling David what's really going on. And part of that is the people have made me afraid. So your maidservant said, let me now speak to the king. Perhaps the king will perform the request of his maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy both me and my son from the inheritance of God. Then your maidservant said, please let the word of my lord the king be comforting, for as the angel of God, the messenger of God, So is my Lord the king to discern good and evil. And may the Lord your God be with you. So when she talks to David about being as an angel of God, a messenger of God, understanding this is the anointed of God, God is working through David, God speaks to David, God directs David, he's able to discern good and evil. And she's asking him to practice that not only in her fictional case, but also in the reality of his son Absalom, to discern the good and evil and to do what's right. Your comments here? Gwen? Back to verse 14, okay? Yeah. Okay, Gwen's asking, verse 14, yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one will not be cast out from him. Could we apply that physically to physical life? I would be reluctant to do that, and I'll tell you why, because it talks about the banished one. And so it's making a particular application to one who has been banished. And when we talk about physical life, yes, it's true that sin that occurred in the Garden of Eden tainted the world forever. And that death and sorrow have been ushered in because of the devil and because of sin. God never planned for that. He gave them the tree of life in the beginning and had fellowship with them, and that was going to continue on forever. God made everything good and very good, including the life that He gave to Adam and Eve. That's true. There might be some slight nuance of that, but I don't know that I'd use this verse for that. It might make me feel like I was reaching a bit far. But an interesting thought. Others? Other ideas? Okay. Then we're going to go on and just notice a few things about this. Well, let's go on to verse 18 through 20 so we move through this fairly quickly. David's going to figure this thing out. David's a smart man. And David's worked enough of his own plans that he knows how to think through this stuff. And so he looks at this woman from Tekoa and he determines right away she didn't come up with this on her own. And he's in this thought process when we enter verse 18. Then the king answered and said to the woman, "Please do not hide anything from me that I'm about to ask you." And the woman said, "Let my lord the king please speak." So the king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" And the woman replied, "As your soul lives, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. Indeed, it was your servant Joab who commanded me. And it was he who put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant, in order to change the appearance of the things your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise, like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all that is in the earth." So Joab commanded her. David figured it out, and he asked her point blank, and she answered truthfully, "Yeah, it was him." Now, when she said, "The people have made me afraid," I've wondered about that, and I don't have a definite answer for it. I have a couple of ideas, and neither one of them may be right. When she said, "The people have made me afraid," I'm wondering how that happened. Is it that the buzz in the nation, the buzz among the people is that this is going to be devastating to our nation, and she has heard this talk going around, and it has caused her to have some fear about the future of the nation if Absalom should be excommunicated for good or even killed? Or is this something to do with the pressure that Joab put on her? That he has somehow threatened her life? And so I have those two things sort of rolling around in my head. It may be neither one of those because it doesn't really tell us. Or it may be a combination of them or something else. But those are two that just sort of popped out in my brain through reading the text about what might be going on there. Anybody else have any comments? Jeremiah? Yeah. Yeah. Jeremiah points out this whole section is built on deception. And it's a deception that's worked against David. It's different than what Nathan did in the parable. That's God teaching David. But in this case, it is Joab deceiving him and through this woman of Tekoa. And this whole thing is a deception, a trick worked against David. And he could have reacted very negatively, but he's showing the character of a king, and particularly a man after God's own heart, that he is patient and tolerant and kind to this woman and doesn't take it out on her. So there's something good in the character of David here, and a lesson for all of us that even when ill will comes our way from somebody else, can we separate the wheat and the chaff of it? And can we take the wheat part and gain the good out of it without being vengeful on the chaff part of it? Some things we deserve, some things we don't. And when it comes to those things that we don't deserve and somebody works that against us, we want to take the chaff part of that and allow it to chafe and react negatively. We learn to take the good, learn something from it, and discard the rest. And David is of good character here to do that. Good points. Anything else? Like, is this more in case you're caught? That here's the way you say it? I don't know. We know he put the words in her mouth about the story. Did he put the words in her mouth about the rest? I don't know. Maybe. That's a maybe. But it's like a lot of things that I wonder about. It's an unknown. But is it possible? Maybe. But she's. Can you feel her neck stretching out? I mean, she's caught. You can just, this poor woman, whatever pressure Joab put on her, it's like if I don't, then this is going to happen, and if I do, this is going to happen, and she's kind of caught in between, and you just feel her neck stretching out, here. And so this is the way it's going. Now, David is going to send Joab at this point, and now you're on to verses 21 through 24, around in there. David is going to send Joab to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. He's going to go across the river, he's going to go to Geshur, and he's going to retrieve Absalom. And Joab is very grateful and knows that David could have been angry about the woman. Now, he's traced it back to Joab. Joab played me. And so Joab's very grateful. David could have reacted. And later, this is interesting as you get into the later part of the chapter, Absalom will later send for Joab and want to be brought into the presence of his father, and Joab won't come. And we have some things to discern about that. But here is a reason why Joab doesn't want any more involvement in it. David's been gracious to Joab. David could have been angry with him and really taken something out on Joab, but he sends Joab to go get Absalom. Joab doesn't want to go a step further with this. He wants to get out of this stuff, out from between David and Absalom, and he doesn't want to. David's been nice to him and kind. And now Joab doesn't want to press his luck. So think about that as we move toward that part of the text. So David is going to allow Absalom to come home with one condition. What's the one condition? Absalom can come back to Jerusalem. One condition. He will not see my face. He can come back, but we're separate and apart from one another, and he will not see my face. So that's the one stipulation that is made. And we're down to verses 29 through 32. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king. But, let me back up to verses 23 and 24. So Joab arose, went to Geshur, brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However, the king said, let him turn to his own house, and let him not see my face. So Absalom turned to his own house and did not see the king's face. Now, verse 29, Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. So he sent again a second time, and he would not come. Therefore he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is next to mine. He has barley. Go and set it on fire. Now, if you back up to verse 28, how long has Absalom been back in Jerusalem? 2 years. 2 years waiting to take vengeance on Amnon. 3 years waiting it out in Geshur. Back to Jerusalem, 2 more years, hasn't seen his father's face. And so he sends someone to Joab and says, tell Joab to come here, I want to talk to him. And Joab doesn't answer. And so he sends again a second time, he doesn't answer. The third time, he said, you see that barley field? That's Joab's, go light it on fire. And so he does that. Verse 31, then Joab arose and came to Absalom at his house and said, did you want me? Now that's the essence of what's going on. I'm going to knock on the door once. I'm going to knock on the door twice. And then I'm going to bust the door down. And so he comes to him and he said, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom answered Joab, behold, I sent for you, saying, come here that I may send you to the king, to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me to still be there. Now, therefore, let me see the king's face, and if there's iniquity in me, let him put me to death. Now, that's packed with some stuff. Here is an application point I want us to get from this. When we don't feel like we're being heard, we burn the barley field. Now, what do I mean by that? When we feel like we're not being heard, we yell. When we feel like we're not being heard, we hit something. We throw something. We threaten. When we feel like we're not being heard, we act out. We burn the barley field, thinking if this is the only way I can get someone's attention, then let it be that way. I'm telling you, it's sinful. It's not the right way to do it. If we're not being heard, we have to understand something. We cannot control other people. We can speak the truth. We can give the opportunity. But the decision is going to be up to them. That's their choice to make. But we cannot control by force other people. We've all erred in that. It's different when we're raising little bitty children. And they're going through that. We intervene, and we as the adult are in control of that situation. That is a training moment. But other people around us are not our little children. And we can't burn the barley field thinking that somehow that's justified with a "look what you made me do now" kind of statement. It's inappropriate. But we tend to, when we feel like we're not being heard, burn the barley field. And so that's what Absalom does, and it does get Joab's attention. But this is not the right kind of reaction that we ought to have today to those kinds of things. It will not be a happy home. It will not be a happy marriage. It will not be a good work environment. It will not bring peace in God's church to burn the barley field. And when people feel like they're not being heard, even on a congregational level, they begin to burn a barley field to cause as much commotion and as much trouble as they possibly can to get attention. And it's not the right way to go about it. Joab is honoring David's condition. He doesn't want to put himself in further jeopardy. He doesn't want any more to do with it. And so he doesn't want to be leverage for Absalom as the commander of the army and someone who is beside the king. He doesn't want to be the one to work this out. This is between father and son. And Joab doesn't want to get any more in the middle of that. Absalom has been 5 years out of his father's presence. Animosity is building, and that's going to lead to the next chapters. There are unresolved issues, and animosity is building. Without communication, suspicion grows. Without communication, the imagination takes over. And we concoct a monster that may not be real at all. But there's this lack of communication going on and a supposing about one another. And this ill will is just building and building and building and building. And Absalom is the kind of man who will be very, very, very patient in his anger. We've already seen that, and we're going to see it again in chapter 15. So Absalom, when he makes this statement at the end of our reading there at verse 32, "If there's iniquity in me, let him put me to death." What is he claiming? Absalom's claim in that statement, what's he saying? I've done nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, Amnon should have been put to death. That's what the law says. That's what David, my father, should have done. I've done nothing wrong. I've done what he failed to do, but I've done nothing wrong. If he finds iniquity in me, I'd like to hear it. Let him put me to death. By the way, then there's David and Bathsheba in the background. And the law says they should have been stoned to death. And God had mercy on David and allowed him to live, and Bathsheba too. So, if there's any iniquity in me, well, let him put me to death. But he's got to be condemning himself in the process, doesn't he? That's the problem when we allow sin in our life, is that it creates all these loopholes and compromises. So the chapter closes with Absalom in the presence of David. And look at verse 33. So when Joab came to the king and told him, he called for Absalom. Thus he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king. This is Absalom, down face first on the ground before his father. And the king kissed Absalom. I want you to think about that scene. In the New Testament, in Romans 16:16, we read that phrase about the churches of Christ salute you. Salute one another with a holy kiss. What's a holy kiss? It's a greeting. It is of sincerity. It is not a ploy. It is single-minded. It is pure. It is honest. It is upfront. It's got nothing fake in it. This falls a little short of that kind of scene. And we'll talk about that. Comment? Holy kiss, set apart for God's purpose. And there's something here that is not pure. There's something that's... Absalom is face first before his father. And I'm telling you, he doesn't mean that. This is part of an ongoing scheme that's going to get played out in chapter 15. It's not honest on Absalom's part. It may have been honest on David's part. But there's something dishonest going on here. There is a parenthetical section. Is that the first buzzer? Okay. A parenthetical section with a physical description of Absalom. You've probably read this before, back in verse 25 through 27. Now in all Israel there was no one as handsome as Absalom, so highly praised. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. When he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it, for it was heavy on him, so that he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels by the king's weight. To Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman beautiful of appearance. Absalom, if you're a Beverly Hillbillies fan, he was the dash riprock of his day. There was no flaw in him from head to toe. His hair weighed, and if you have some kind of a footnote here, do you have something in the neighborhood of 3 to 6 pounds? Anybody have anything like that in a footnote? 5 pounds? That's 3 to 6. Okay, so 3 to 6 pounds is what his hair weighed. And I ran into an interesting article about hair. If I've got time, here's a clip from it. Turns out if your hair is very long and thick, it might weigh around 2 to 5 ounces. If you tend to keep your hair shorter than around mid-back length, you won't even notice a change on the scale at all if it's a little shorter or longer. Even dreadlocks, which are extremely thick and dense, won't weigh that much. I read an account of a man with world record 62-foot long dreads that only weighed about 3 pounds total. I read other accounts of people with 10-foot long dreads that only weighed about half a pound. Absalom cut his hair at the end of every year, and it was 3 to 6 pounds. How much hair did that guy have? How thick was that hair? What would that have looked like? All right, here he comes. Now this is what he's going to do in chapter 15. Riding along in his chariot with 50 runners out in front of him, wind blowing. Not a defect in the guy. Can you imagine the scene of Absalom? And so we're looking at him now in chapters 15 through 18, where he's going to rebel against his father. Ultimately, he's going to be killed by none other than Joab, who brought him back from Geshur. What a turn of events. And he's going to work his coup in chapter 15, and David, his father, will have to flee Jerusalem. We'll lay out chapter 15 next week, and we'll get into that. I really appreciate your attention, your comments. We are dismissed from class.